Welcome to Storytelling with Data, the podcast where listeners around the world learn to be better storytellers and presenters with best-selling author, speaker, and workshop guru Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. We'll cover a wide range of topics that will help you effectively show and tell your data stories. So get ready to separate yourself from the mess of 3D exploding pie charts and deliver knockout presentations. And with that, here's Cole.
Hello, welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Cole, and I am excited today to be chatting with Kenneth Field. Ken, welcome to the Storytelling with Data podcast.
Hi, Cole. Good to be here, or good to be at home, but to be here as well. And thanks very much for inviting me.
Ken is a cartographer. He's principal software product engineer at Esri, where he spends his time talking about and writing about maps. Speaking of writing about maps, he's also the author of the award-winning book, Cartography. Now, I first came across Ken's work back when we were still getting together in person at the Tapestry conference in 2019. And it seems to me like since that point, every conversation I've been in where the topic of maps has come up, so has Ken's name.
That's not necessarily a good thing.
No, it comes up in a good way. And we're doing a few things related to maps at Storytelling with Data this month. So it seemed like the perfect time for us to get to better know Ken's work, as well as to share it with everyone here today. So just quickly, for those who are tuning in live, you'll have the opportunity to help steer our conversation through your questions. You can do that by sticking those at any point into the chat window. I'll be monitoring that and incorporating it into our conversation as we go along. So to kick things off, Ken, for those watching and listening who may not be familiar with you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about you, your background, what led you into this field, the path your career has taken?
Sure. So you'll probably all gather by now that I'm not an American. So I'm from the UK, although I now live and work in America. I grew up in a city called Nottingham, right in the middle of the UK, and often people say, "Well, how did you generate an interest in maps?" Now, I can't really put my finger on it, but I do know my father was a geologist. We spent most of our summers out in Norway doing field work. He and his students were constantly drawing maps by hand with all the beautiful geological maps with coloured pencils and things. And I guess in some way that must have inspired me. And I went on to do a cartography bachelor's degree in the UK. And graduated from that at just about the point at which GIS, Geographical Information Systems, was killing traditional cartography. So all of the sort of skills I'd learned with pens and photomechanical techniques were now replaced by the computer. So you had to retool very quickly, and this has become a theme of cartography over the years. You have to kind of adapt or get left behind. And I fell into teaching. Then spent 20 years in UK universities in academia teaching map design, leading GIS courses. And then in 2011, I had the opportunity to just completely change tack and try something different. And I joined Esri in Southern California. Been here now for 10 years, almost to the day. And it's wonderful. I basically get to do everything I did as an academic, teach and write and help people make better maps. I just don't have to grade student work anymore, which is pleasing. So that's a very, very brief overview of where I'm from, what I do.
So let's start with a super basic question, which is, when should someone turn to a map when they've got data that they want to visualize? What's the right scenario, or how should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, so I guess you'd expect a cartographer to say you should always put something on a map, but I come at it from a slightly different perspective. All maps are based on data, whether it's a topographic or a thematic map. And I guess here today we're going to talk mostly about thematic mapping. That's mapping of themed information or population-based data or some empirical data. But you turn to a map when it's the where that matters. The spatial component, the geography, where you want to compare a variable perhaps between and among places, or seeing what a relationship is between variables in a specific place, or comparing patterns across space that have changed over time. perhaps understanding how my situation compares to your situation, where we live may be very, very similar, it may be very, very different. And those are the interesting questions. So it's when the where component is critical. And the danger, of course, is often that people will automatically go to a map if the data has some sort of locational component, of which most data does. But you don't necessarily need to use that in order to tell the story you want to tell.
And are there specific questions? So someone's got some geographic data, they're thinking about using a map. Are there specific questions they can pose beyond just the where being important that'll help either direct them toward or away from a map as a good choice?
It's really whether you want your map reader to be able to understand the geography of what it is you're looking at. That's just the important question to ask. And in many senses, if you were just in the graphical realm and you want to, put, pass your data through something that turns it into a bar chart or a line chart or a scatter plot or whatever, the process of selecting the type of visualization that might be appropriate to the data is the same for a map. And so I guess what you're really saying is there's a sort of a meta level here. The initial question is my question or is my story better served by using a map or a graph, and possibly even a combination of both. So that would be the key thing, to ask that meta question first, not just go straight on in for a map head first, or you always do a bar chart first. Well, maybe not.
And then once someone has determined, okay, map makes sense, there's a where component, there's something interesting about the geography that I want to be able to depict visually, what are the sorts of things that people should be doing and understanding about their data potentially before they just go straight to the map? Are there steps to take to understand the data?
I would advise that for any sort of data visualization, and a map is no different. And depending on which camp you're in, you can argue that cartography is in fact just a form of data visualization anyway. It's a subset of. Um, some might say it's a completely different subset, but I think it's a subset. And
Do you fall into the former camp?
I tend to think of cartography as a very special subset because it comes with
That's fair.
its own set of things that help to define it. I don't necessarily think of it as an art and a science that sits in its own bubble or its own little entity. I think it has a lot of parallels with visual communication, visual design, lots of different shared aspects. But yes, going back to the question, always look at your data. I don't think. Well, I think you're going to be awfully lucky if you can just pour data into a piece of software, and out the other end pops a map that happens to work extremely well. I think that's probably more luck by judgment, generally speaking. Um, I mean, a little bit of knowledge goes a long way to help you sort of, navigate that path to a better map more easily. But yeah, looking at your data, understanding the distribution, looking at basic descriptive statistics even to help you see what's in the data that's interesting. What do you want to tease out? Do you want to tease out commonality across a map, or do you want to show outliers? And there are ways you can design the map, obviously, that will help lead the reader towards those conclusions, and to help them to explore the map in that particular way. But yes, always look at your data. Try to understand the data. The flip side to that, of course, is that a map can also still be used as an exploratory tool to just to look at the data. I mean, you quite often just make a map of data and you look at it and go, well, that's pretty boring. There's no point in making the map. Or the map will magically reveal something to you that you hadn't even imagined. So I'm not saying, don't just play around with the map as a vehicle to understand your data. The two things are very, very complementary to one another.
But I think, yeah, it's useful to say these words, right? Because I think with tools and software making things so easy that a lot of people expect you can just push a button and something useful comes out the other end, which fortunately or unfortunately is not the case. You mentioned design, and in your book you talk about designing maps with intent, right? So all maps are designed, but some better than others, obviously. Are there specific components or aspects that make for a good map? Things that always should be there or always should be done a certain way?
I think it's not necessarily the practical aspects that are helpful when I talk about design with intent. It's the thought and the thinking that goes in um, during the whole process of making the map. The map itself is really just a product of lots and lots of stuff. Our own experiences, our objectivity or subjectivity, what we're aware of, what we're not aware of, and all of the other components. And the map is just the end product, really. So the process is important. I think understanding the process is part of the way to making a better map. And I've also been very careful with my wording there. Right? It's hard to say, this is a good map, this is a bad map. It's a very binary way of looking at cartography. I prefer to see things more on a grayscale, from better through to poorer. And one of the ways in which you can tend towards making a better map is understanding more the person for whom you're making the map. Who's going to use it is far more important than you as the person that's making it, and it has to function in a way that fits its purpose. Even if that's just simply an ephemeral map that exists merely to please the eye. I'm just making something illustrative or perhaps artistic. Those maps are just as valid as perhaps the one where we've got some hardcore statistics that we need to relate to a certain audience. I would err towards simplicity and symbolization rather than cluttering a map. I would err towards not trying to imbue too much into my symbols, just to keep it as simple as you possibly can. Often muted colors work best. Limit the mix of typefaces, palettes. Show restraint, I think, and that's part of the thinking process. That's part of explaining to yourself how the map needs to look, and then translating it into the final product through whatever software or other mechanism you have. Should go easier, and the end product should therefore be purposeful, more purposeful.
And when you say explain to yourself, say more about that. Should people actually be verbalizing what they want to do with their maps, or help me understand your thought process there?
Well, I think that the process is going to differ depending on who you are and how you approach these sort of design tasks. For me, it's simply still get a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil and start sketching and start to see how the map evolves as a product of you just churning through the ideas in your mind. What is it you want to show? What is it you want to tell? How do you want to do this? Do you want to do this in a fairly austere manner? Perhaps you're publishing in a statistical textbook, or maybe you want to put your map on the front page of a national newspaper, in which case the same data might need to be imagined in perhaps a more attention-grabbing way, because you want readership. So that's really what I mean about trying to explain to yourself. I mean, I won't say I have voices inside my head telling me how to do things, but it's a little bit like that. It's just sitting there in a quiet space and working things out and spending time thinking, and also talking with your friends and colleagues, and asking for opinions and bringing a lot of experience together can often help.
And this was one of the things when you and I were chatting in preparation for this that we spent a little bit of time on, that I find so interesting. Because you talked a little bit about you went to school to make maps, and then GIS came along and changed everything. Can you talk about how the ease of creating in software has impacted the way that we think about and make maps?
Uh, yeah, I mean, like I said, so I graduated in 1991 from my cartography degree, and I'd learned all about, how to use scribe coat and etching tools and dark rooms to do all sorts of stuff with photographic equipment to make maps, and a map would take me 10 weeks to make. But that 10 weeks was kind of interesting because you had to really deeply think about every mark you put on the map, because if you made a mistake, you might be uh, having to redo 2 weeks worth of work, or you might have just wasted hundreds of dollars worth of materials in the it was expensive to make mistakes. So you kind of became attuned to having to get it right first time, but you had a nice amount of time in which to do that. Now these days, technology has compressed that time to basically nothing. I can make the same map now in about 5 minutes than it used to take me 10 weeks to make. And that's
Which
brilliant.
sounds like an
That's
amazing thing,
It
right?
is, but it is great, right? I mean, it's fantastic. But there is a slight downside to it. Yeah, it's much easier. There's more data available. It's quicker to make every mark on a map, but those marks still require thought and application. So that's where I kind of see, teaching about this as being vital, because the more you can kind of understand a little bit about the map making or the map design process, the quicker you can overcome that problem of compression of time, because you'll come to a better decision more quickly. And if you make a mistake now, it's not really a problem either, I guess, because you can easily fix it. But do you fix it is the question. Do you accept that the software is just giving you the map, or do you sit there and look at it a little bit critically and say, I'm not sure that actually does the job? And as I said, the great thing is the technology means that you can fix it very quickly, if you're aware of what you've done is perhaps suboptimal. So I wouldn't go back to those olden days. I wouldn't do it. Um,
Well, it's
but
interesting though, right? Because it means that we have to intentionally seek out that time for thought and intentionally do things like sketch and explain to ourselves so that we can slow down the process so that we can put some of that active thought into it versus just pushing the button,
yeah, and a lot of
which means we
maps
can
use.
skip that part, which is a problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. And a lot of maps now are made on very tight deadlines, and I'm not just necessarily talking journalistic um, deadlines, but you know, I meet so many people who have to make a map by this Friday or whenever it might be, and perhaps people that are commissioning work from cartographers maybe don't necessarily appreciate that you're going to pay that person partly for their thinking time, or if you're just making a map because you want to mess about with some data, that's great. But I truly believe that thinking, using the computer up in our heads is a major way to leading towards making a better map, because you're processing all sorts of stuff up there. It's maps I've seen in the past that have perhaps taken a particular aesthetic, and I just suddenly go, oh yeah, I remember that, and let me go and pick that out and hunt that out again. Maybe I recall a map with a very nice um, color palette, and I need to go and hunt that out. And going back to a lot of that early work and finding stuff is part of that thought process.
This reminds me of in the preface in your book, you outline your cartographic tenets, uh, right? So do things like don't take shortcuts, do things right, or when in doubt, do what's been done before, right? Follow best practices. Can you talk more about some of your tenets that you're thinking about, either when you're creating a graph or when you're helping guide or a map or when you're helping guide others?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't lay these tenets down as firm and fast, or that everybody should follow. They work for me.
There was nothing you could argue against as bad advice, though, right? It was all very
I
good
don't know.
advice.
You think, hopefully, um, I mean, make the map, make the right map is really just a sort of you know a call to say we don't always have to make a map. It's like we said at the start. If you're going to make a map, make it right. There's no there's no real shortcuts to making the map right, but you may as well do the job. If you're going to do the job at all, you may as well, do it to the best of your ability. But I do want to pick up on this idea of best practices, because there's a whole there's a whole side of cartography based in academia, as well as a whole side of cartography based in practice, and in the map publishing industry. And over decades and longer, best practices have emerged. We better understand how people view symbols as signs. We better understand how people see color in different ways and how that imbues meaning into a map. We better understand interaction now on our mobile devices and how people, um, work with edgeless maps, but which are constrained within a screen size. A lot of these things are now better understood, but they're not really rules. A lot of people start to think of a lot of map making as being rules based, and it's not. There's hardly any rules in cartography at all. Maybe, I mean, I probably think of one or two, where technically something just does not work because of a technical limitation of the map type or something. Um, but it's always a good starting point to work with the best practices, and if you kind of understand what many of those are, I think you're well placed to break some of them. You're well placed to try to say, okay, well, maybe I can go a little bit beyond what convention might see me or suggest to me I should use, and you know break the rules. I mean, rules are always there to be broken, even though I've just said there are hardly any rules anyway. But starting with best practices, I think, is a good tenet, and learning from what's gone before is a good tenet. And there really is very little new, or genuinely innovative. I mean, a lot of stuff that we see is derived from what people have been making for hundreds of years. And there's a whole other thing, the history of cartography. And I'm not saying everybody has to become a student of cartography or the history, or understand all of this, but a lot of stuff's been done, and a lot of stuff's been done really well over many years, and they're great starting points for learning and for doing your own work.
Yeah, I find myself nodding as you talk, and I was finding as I was looking through your book and reading portions of it that I've felt like I've found a kindred spirit because so much of how we talk about helping people think about their data and their audiences when they're trying to design a graph, it's the same, right? And it's because, going back to what you said before, that cartography, the map is just another way to look at data and a certain type of data when it's a certain story you want to be able to tell, or a certain thing you want to be able to bring light to.
Well, it's a language, right? It's just a language.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, I always go back to, the sort of 1950s, 60s with William Balkin and Alice Coleman's, um, claim that we should add a fourth ace to the pack: numeracy, articulacy, literacy, and graphicacy.
I like how you say it, though. Graphicacy is how I would have gone for it. But graphicacy sounds more.
Let's agree that it's exactly the same.
Yes.
But it's true. Throughout our schooling, we hopefully learn how to speak very, very vaguely eloquently. We can learn to write and hopefully put words in broadly the right order. Some of us are more numerate than others, and graphics is the same. It's a language, and learning the syntax and learning what works and what doesn't work. You can talk absolute gibberish graphically, or you can have something, speak eloquently. And I would, and that goes for whether we're talking about a beautifully structured histogram. If we're not going to lose people by talking about things like that, or a nicely,
not in this crowd,
a nicely worked, nicely worked choropleth map, which is one of the most, commonplace maps you could ever wish to use. And a lot of people just think, can we do something a bit more impressive? Well, I don't think there's anything more impressive than an extremely well-made commonplace map type, and that's graphicacy in action, I would think.
Absolutely, and we see this on the data viz side as well, right? Or on the graph side, which is people looking for something beyond a bar chart, even though the best bar chart would actually serve things well. But since you mentioned choropleth as a common type of map, is there other nomenclature that people who maybe haven't been in the map world should know when they're thinking about making a map and wanting to investigate different types of maps that they might make or create?
I think your favorite software package will have a set of default map renderers of some form, and they're broadly going to be a choropleth map, which is sometimes referred to as a graduated color map, where you're looking at different shades of a color across a map. Darker means more, generally speaking, um, unless you're on a dark background like a screen, when in fact the inverse works better. Proportional or graduated symbols are slightly different to one another, but you're basically sizing a data magnitude by a symbol. So larger tends to be seen as more. Interpolated surfaces, they've they've become over the last 10 years referred to as heat maps, but they're not really heat maps. A heat map is a sort of a very particular type of graph, but I think the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is maybe a contoured surface where you have a hotter parts and cooler parts, equaling more or less of something. Dot density maps, where individual dots are encoded with a value and given a size and then positioned across the map. They're very useful, and they're probably the major categories of commonplace maps. But you can go into the world of cartograms, which I happen to absolutely love, and some people really don't. Um, they can lead to some fairly visceral reactions among people, depending on the type of weird, bizarre, misshapen geographies that you can
That's what
generate
I was going
through
to ask. Is it
building
about
a
the
cartogram.
shapes, or can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about what a cartogram is for those who may not be familiar?
Okay, so a standard geographic map. Let's start there. It's a familiar shape to most people, and that's part of the beauty of using a geographical map. But you soon run into problems, and if we just think of the U.S. states, I mean, not least the fact that Alaska is this huge area of land that isn't even joined to the lower 48. That presents its own problems, but all of the states are very, very different sizes, but you can't see them as anything other than what they are. That's it. That's the way in which the country's been divided up at state level, or the way in which it's formed over history at state level. But they also have very, very different population densities, and you end up with a lot of very large states with low population densities and a lot of small states with large population densities. So for a map, that often means you have small symbols, uh, or not a lot, that exhausts a lot of the real estate on your map, and you have a lot of overlapping symbols or other stuff going on and making very crowded parts of the highly populated places on the map. Now, there are ways in which you can accommodate that to some extent on a geographical map, but a cartogram will equalize space across the map. So it might show every state as a proportion of its population, or a proportion of the data that you're making, and we would call that a population density equalizing cartogram, to give it its full
To
ridiculous
keep things
title.
simple.
Yeah, exactly. And they're the weird misshapen geography type maps that you see that people sometimes look at, and they're very, very difficult to interpret unless there's a lot of labels and all sorts of other things going on. But you can make simplified cartograms, like a gridded cartogram, where perhaps each state is represented by a single hexagon or a square of the same size, and then that acts as a container into which you can put your data symbolized in some other way, either through shades or even by embedding charts into the map. Um, there are other types of cartogram where you just turn the geographies into a consistent shape, like a circle, which are then reorganized across space. That's a Dawling cartogram. So there's varieties, but in some way or other, they all share a common theme, which is they're trying to get away from geography and the problems that that creates for um, visually interpreting my dog, who's now shouting across. Yeah, for visual interpretation of whatever the data is, and on any map, surely that's the thing that you want. You want to have um, people look at is the patterns in the data, and not just the pattern that the geography leads the eye to believe.
And when it comes to some of these different types of maps that you mentioned, which ones are people going to find in their normal or their go-to tools, and where do you actually need a specialist to help create some of these?
Yeah, a lot of the more specialist maps tend to have to be, at least in some way, built manually through a series of, mathematical juggling with the data, whether it's the geography or, building some of these cartograms can either be done through third-party software using algorithms or, it's a whole mix of tools um, that you'll find in very many different places. But in most software, whether it's GIS or illustration or through code, you'll be able to find libraries and mechanisms and tutorials to get you to an endpoint in your preferred mode of production.
Mike has a question, which is how can I most effectively show change over time on a map?
Great question. So the one of the problems with time on a map is, generally speaking, a map is a slice of time, and how do you do this? Well, one way is to animate. If you have a tool of production that will allow you to animate through a stack of images, maybe 30 years worth of data, and you will see the change through time. The problem with that is you have to make sure you consistently encode the data so that you see that change, as opposed to each map having a separate encoding of data that perhaps is unique to that range of data. But I would tend towards something like the use of small multiples. Now, the drawback is you're reducing the size of the map, so you're probably going to have to generalize. Uh, for instance, you probably would have to stick with state level data for the US as opposed to county level data if you're going to make a series of 25 or 30 small multiples, which are each going to maybe only be 1.5 inches wide. But small multiples are really good because it brings all of the time slices into view at once. And if you organize them, let's say top left to bottom right, there's a natural way of reading a set of small multiples that works pretty well, I find. So animation or small multiples is generally the way I would approach it.
So I want to talk a little bit about your book. I have it here, so I'm going to show it for the virtue of those who are watching. So it is massive. It is, I believe, 549 pages. And I just want to open up to a couple of spreads because it's also dense. But I've been telling my team, I think it's one of the most impressive books I've ever seen because there's so much information in it, and yet it's organized in such an easy to consume fashion, which I guess would
I'll
be
send this over
expected.
immediately, Cole.
To be expected, right, from someone who designs maps and thinks about visual hierarchy and knowing where you are and where you're going and all of that. But can you tell us a little bit about the book? And then I want to get into some topics
Sure.
that are within the book as well.
So I had an idea for, well, okay, there's lots of backstories that I won't bore everyone with, but there's a couple of interesting ones. People have always said, right, you've got opinions, why don't you write a book? And I said, well, because I've got a bookshelf of books on cartography, and why don't people just go out and buy those? Yet they don't, right? You know, books have a bookshelf. They have a lifespan, and there's a lot of texts that I had when I was a student that, a lot of the technology has changed massively, so you don't necessarily go back to some of those as often as you could. And I proposed this book, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12, 15 years ago, And it never really got off the ground because I was still, doing the academia thing, and writing books was never seen as something particularly valuable for a university. And then when I moved to California, our company has its own press, and I raised the issue, the idea again, and got a bit of traction. And really, what I wanted it to be was just a scrapbook of everything I'd learned, to put back, just to give back to the community that has shaped my life and career, and from which I've gained an enormous amount of enjoyment over the 30 odd years I've been in it. Um, and I knew I had one attempt at this, right? I had one shot at making what I thought was, the modern version of a cartography textbook. And it was very important to me that um, I was responsible for the layout as well, because most times with a book, you generate a manuscript and you might have some images and you hand it off to, people who
Someone
then
else.
design the layout. And I just said, no, if I'm going to be, telling people what I think about cartography through the words, I've also got to demonstrate it, right? I've got to actually, put the money where my mouth is, and stand behind every mark in that book. And I had help from a couple of my excellent colleagues, John Nelson and Wesley Jones, with some of the illustrations that you see on the right hand of every spread. But other than that, every single mark in there is mine. That is one of Wes's fantasy maps. It's great. So that's a little bit about the book. I was also delighted that I was given pretty much a free rein to develop it. I obviously had great editorial colleagues who found 22,000 errors that were corrected.
Oh my goodness. How long did it take you from start to finish?
3 years, maybe that book, about 3 years. Yeah, it's amazing what sort of, I mean, when I say errors, I'm just talking about, a misplaced comma, or,
Sure.
a slight glitch in where a graphic is placed and needed to be changed like a 16th of an inch or something.
Yeah.
And, but no, I had a problem with the Oxford comma as well that I can admit to now. So that was corrected. So even though you're writing something, you're always learning at the same time. And for me, it was a fascinating process to go through to write that book. And it's had some fantastic feedback. People tend to enjoy it and like its format. And I tried to do it as an alphabetic
Yes.
reference as opposed to by chapter, because most of the textbooks I have on my shelf, cartography textbooks, they start off chapter 1, the Earth, which then leads immediately to map projections. And you've lost people by then.
Potentially.
Map projections are critical, absolutely vital, and that's so important to making a better map. But kicking off a textbook with all that math is not necessarily the way to pull people in. And then you have chapters on color, and you have chapters on typography, and you have chapters on layout. And you don't make a map like that. You don't make a map in that linear way. You don't choose your projection and then choose your colors and then you apply your type. It's much bigger soup. So I wanted a book that was going to allow people to dive in at different places and find that nugget of information that helps them with a very specific immediate task. That the following day they might have a very different mapping task to do on the same map. But
yeah, and just to give folks a sense, so I would say anyone who is putting data into anything, right? It could be maps, it could be graphs, that there is excellent information in here to be able to be more thoughtful about how you're doing that. I'm just going to flip through a couple of pages to give folks a sense of the breadth of the kinds of topics that are in here. So each two side facing spread is the topic on the left and then an image on the right. And so it's bite sized in terms of you get everything relative to the given topic in 2 pages, and then links to elsewhere in the book to read related things. But so I'm in the G's right now: graphic and dynamic labeling, graphicacy, which we talked about a little bit. Oh, I'm in the graph section here. I'll skip to another letter. Oh, here's a page of a jack-o'-lantern maps. Old is new again. OpenStreetMaps, ordinal data. So you get a lot of insight into things behind the scenes as well. Orientation. Yeah, there's all sorts of great stuff. So I highly would recommend it for anyone for sure who's doing anything with maps, but I think anyone who's doing anything with data stands to benefit a lot from the information that you've shared there.
Thank you. Yeah, it was built for two audiences, both the beginner and the experienced, and that drove my colleagues in the publishing team spare, because they wanted to know who it was for, who's the target market. And I genuinely said, I think everybody. Software is made that anybody can use to make a map. Therefore, why wouldn't you have a book that appeals to that broad audience as well? So hopefully beginners can pick it up and just find that bit of information. Oh, right, I'll use that instead of that. That's a great outcome. But even as a professional, as a desk guide or a monitor stand, it has a value, just there as a reference tool. But I can't keep it all in my head, so I'm glad I
Right,
had
now
the
you've got
opportunity to
you've made a
write
reference
it
for
down.
yourself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's things in there that I go back. Did I write? Yeah, I wrote that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good. So let's talk about one of the topics in the book that you and I chatted on briefly before as well, but maps as truth, right? You put something in a map and suddenly it has this precision associated with it, but there's error and bias that goes into that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, unfortunately for anybody who wants to write a book on cartography, Marc Monmonier already stole the best title for a book about maps with his how to lie with maps, because all maps do lie to some extent or another, whether it's positional accuracy, whether it's precision, whether that precision is implied or otherwise. And does the map either have or need to convey any potential error, bias, uncertainty? Is the map wholly objective? Is it based on some sort of robotic, sterile processing of data, or is the map maker trying to put some of their own um, agenda in there, either deliberately or sometimes, by accident? And you can take this to the natural extent of what we might refer to as propagandist cartography or persuasive cartography, and there's a whole raft of work you can look at, particularly some of the posters and the maps that were made around the time of the Second World War. Some amazing on all sides, amazing maps that painted a picture in very different ways for very different reasons. And I guess what it really boils down to is one person's truth can look very, very different to another person's truth, even though the same data is being used. It can be manufactured in many different ways to lead people down a particular visual path. And in an ideal world, of course, every cartographer is wholly objective. They're free of bias, they're free of experiences that might shape what they do and how they do. But in truth, that's not the case. And there are often times when I'll make a map and someone will look at it and go, "Oh, did you know that that's interpreted in a particular way, or I see that in a different way than you might." And of course, you have to step back and do a bit more of that thinking that I mentioned. So the other side to this equation is, of course, the map reading side,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody brings their own eyes to the work you've created. And that's part of the cartographic challenge, is how do you meet the objectives of creating a map that might need to appeal to an extremely broad church of map reading eyes who might see things in wholly different ways. And that's part of the art of cartography. It's not just making a map that looks good. It's about applying the science well, and that science includes understanding an awful lot about human perception, human cognition, and many of the biases that we might put into a map, or also which might underpin how the map is read. It's that's the challenge for a lot of making of maps is understanding some of that and understanding how, you know, the different versions of the truth are going to be seen in the map.
And I hadn't heard a term put on that before, but in the book you talk about conceptual accuracy, right? So the location can be precise, but there's all this other stuff in terms that the person who's creating the visualization is determining when it comes to what's included or omitted, how is it represented, right? The objectivity. So how do we make a map that's objective? Can we make a map that's objective?
Well, I think, and I included these in the book as well, Borden Dent's sort of code for cartographers, which I updated slightly. And I'll just very briefly read them, and I think they still apply. It's, have a straightforward agenda, strive to know your audience, try not to intentionally lie, always show all relevant data when possible, as in, don't obscure or obfuscate things. Don't discard contrary data just because it's contrary to what it is you want to show. Strive for accurate portrayal of data, avoid plagiarizing, selecting symbols that don't bias the map. The map, just like any piece of research, ought to be repeatable. There shouldn't be some secret source in there that only you know how you turned the data into that way. And pay attention to different cultural values and principles. And I think this sort of code, I forget how many years, a couple of decades ago, these were written, but I think still they're reasonable to have in mind for anybody who's trying to remain impartial. But of course, we have to also remember that many of us will be working for organisations that do not want us to make impartial maps. We have to make a map that supports an organisation's agenda, or a style, or I'm very lucky. I get to make maps that are generally free from constraint, because I'm demonstrating techniques and methods and ideas. But many map makers work for organizations that will have an overarching requirement of their employers. So the map does come with inherent design bias. I mean, it might not do any damage. It's just, it might support a particular company need, or even a color scheme. You want the color scheme on your map to fit the corporate style. That's a
constraint.
that's a constraint, right? And you have to work with it rather than try to go against it. But I mean, one of the examples that I certainly used in the last few years when talking about this idea is, back in it was the start of 2017, after Donald Trump had beaten Hillary Clinton to the presidency, and there was a very famous photograph taken in the corridors of the White House as he and the staff were moving in, taken by Trey Yingst, a reporter, and it showed a White House staffer putting excellent. It showed a White House staffer putting a map on the wall, and later Trump spoke about that map in an interview, and quoted, look at all this red. This is all of us. We won the election. And at the time there was quite a lot of chat around, and certainly in data viz and mapping circles, quite a lot of chat about that map. And a lot of takes were very much of the opinion that the map was, in some way incorrect, because it was a standard diverging color scheme choropleth map showing the greater percentage of share of vote by county. So it goes back to that problem I mentioned earlier about geography. There are a lot of very sparsely populated counties that were 95% plus Republican votes. So of course they're going to be dark red, and there's a lot of them. And a lot of the Democrat votes are in very small geographies in and around major urban areas or towards the coasts. Well, what happens? It creates a map that almost looks uniformly red, right? And why wouldn't you, as a Republican president who's just won the election, use that map? I'd put it on the wall. That's the map I'd choose. It's nothing wrong with it whatsoever, technically. But of course, if you can imagine, I think it was a couple of 100,000 votes had gone the other way, and Clinton had won 2 or 3 other states,
Yeah.
basically with hardly any difference in the data. That same picture could have been taken with a Clinton staffer putting a map on the wall that looked almost uniformly blue, and I've made that map. You can make those maps out of that data. Again, it would be correct technically, and in terms of who made it, and they're wanting to appeal to a particular base, and yeah, that's the map I would use. So it just goes to show that you can make at least two, if not more, maps of exactly the same data to look massively, massively different.
Yeah, and so being aware of that, right, both as someone who produces visualizations and for sure as we're consuming different visualizations in the media and elsewhere, yeah, looking for that and seeing things through both lenses. This may be a good segue. We're almost out of time, but I want to make sure we talk at least a little bit about you have a new book that you're working on as well, right?
It's finished. I've finished writing
Yay.
it, and that last example segues nicely into it. So it's all about thematic mapping, and its subtitle is currently something like 101 ways to visualize empirical data. So I take a single data set, and that data is the 2016 presidential election results, and I've made 101 maps of exactly the same data. Although I should state that one chapter is called Graphs, Charts, and Plots. So I specifically take a whole chapter. There's 9 chapters, I think, in total. I take one chapter out of the maps and say, you know
One
what,
chapter for graphs.
let's just give a nod to graphs, even though I said earlier cartography is the subset, right? But I thought it was important to say, sometimes the best map is no map, and to actually explore some of the fantastic ways that you can use graphs and charts to narrate the story. And I'll give you an example of that, in that we often see the strict red blue state map showing the results, and it's correct, right? It's states either go blue or red, and you can then counter the electoral college votes that go with that. But what does the map show? I mean, it, it will almost predominantly veer towards the red, certainly for many or the last few election cycles, just because of the geography in the big states that go red. But I like just a simple graphic bar. Or why don't we just even use two numbers? 302 or 320 or versus whatever the other side. I mean, that's the result, right? You don't necessarily need the map to convey that. So it's all written, and hopefully we'll get it out as soon as we possibly can.
Fantastic. So I would like to talk more. And I never know, the time goes by so fast when I get to talk with someone else. But we're almost out of time. And so I want to move into closing from here. You've shared a ton of great stuff with us, right? And one of the things that you mentioned near the end of the book, and you mentioned earlier as well, but that cartography has changed from maps made by the few to maps made by the many. And I know we've talked a little bit about some of the darker sides of that in terms of maybe not having the time and the thought and needing to actively carve out our intentions for that. But maybe we can wrap up by talking about some of the opportunity that comes with this, right? Anyone could potentially make a map now. How do you
Yeah,
feel about that?
I think it's great. I think it's wonderful. I mean, why wouldn't I mean, it's job security to be an expert in a niche area, right? But actually, all it means is, it's lucky. It's lucky for me because my career is helping and teaching people. So the more people there are to help and teach, that's fantastic. And I would encourage anybody who wants to experiment with cartography to do just that, and to enjoy it and have fun with it. It's a fantastic vehicle for playing with data, exploring something to do with the data, and seeing what comes out at the other end. I love it. I don't think there's a better time to be a cartographer, a geographer, a map maker. Everything in the last decade has ramped up to give people the ability to basically get dirty with geographical data and make maps.
Get dirty with geographical data and make maps. I like it. Ken, where can people follow your work?
At the moment, Twitter's the main mechanism for sharing what I do. I think it will continue to be so for a while. So I normally sort of, and I talk about football and beer and stuff there. So you have to take the rough with the smooth. The maps I make are all available at carto.maps.arcgis.com. You can go there to print out some of the print maps I've made or look at some of the web maps I've made, where I tend to try to explore map types and create maps using what I think are best practices that then people can just look at and steal. So that's kind of the two main places.
Great. We'll put those in the show notes too for easy access for folks.
But I also I write blogs for Esri, my employer. I also write on the International Cartographic Association blogs. I have my own blog. I'm basically out there somewhere, even though I'm stuck here.
Ken, any final thoughts to share with us today?
Yeah, I do have one. It's a little flow, but we talk a lot about automation, but actually cartography is really a very human activity, and you don't have to be a cartographer to make a great map. And I'd just like to make the point that some of the most recognizable maps of data were made by non-cartographers or people who hadn't had any formal cartographic training, but they were humans. They wanted to communicate data better. And if I just throw three names at you who I'm quite sure need no explanation, that would be Charles Maynard, Florence Nightingale, Harry Beck. Those three people are responsible for three of possibly the most famous map-based data visualizations that you're ever likely to see. And none of them were cartographers. So that proves that you don't need to be a cartographer to make a map. That said, getting advice from someone with a background or some experience in cartography will often help, and it can shortcut that compression of time that everybody has. So, sometimes somebody will say to me, Ken, can you just cast your eyes on this map for 5 minutes? And in so doing, I might be able to pick up, 2 or 3 very quick things that can be very simply implemented to make that map better. And in that sense, collaboration is key. We don't all know everything. I certainly don't. I'm always asking for assistance and help and eyes on my maps, even if sometimes I don't like the response. Sometimes people just don't like your work, but collaboration is always going to improve your work. So I guess that's probably a decent place to stop.
Yes, fantastic sentiment with which to end. Ken, it has been a pleasure to chat. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And as I said, I definitely recommend Ken's book, Cartography. Stay tuned for his
that's another $20.
I'll also take this as an opportunity to mention that the Storytelling with Data Challenge and our live event this month, we're in March 2021 as we're recording this, are both focused on maps. So if you want to do more there, you can learn more at community.storytellingwithdata.com. And with that, for everyone watching and listening, I'll say thank you very much for tuning in.